So I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Frankel, who's Head of Public Affairs at Full Fact and formerly Social Media Editor at the BBC. And so Mark, I wonder if you could just start off by telling us a bit about Full Fact and what you try and do there as an organisation.
Yeah, so Full Fact was started about 15 years ago, essentially to deal with the question of politicians lying to us. We all know it happens. It's happening day to day. Politicians often go into politics for very good reason, but for a variety of reasons, we end up hearing falsehoods. It's expanded over time, and we now look at online misinformation, we look at health misinformation, and essentially we're a fact-checking organisation organised to try to bring better information to public attention. And not just bring the better information to public attention, but try to raise standards in behaviour in public life. So we're as interested in correcting the error as we are in encouraging the person or organisation to take responsibility for their actions and do something about the errors that they've made.
And so here at LIS, we think quite a lot about kind of the information environment. We're interested in all different kinds of information, all different kinds of knowledge across different fields and disciplines. But obviously, like everybody we've observed, in many ways, it's becoming a more challenging environment. How have you found that in recent years in terms of kind of changes in the information environment?
Well, there are huge changes in the information environment. We are living in incredibly atomised times where the public are relying or looking for reliable information wherever they can find it, but increasingly finding themselves wandering or even running down rabbit holes. We all know, we've read about it day to day, all the health misinformation that we see around ourselves, wellness therapies purporting to cure cancer, different ways in which people are relying on different therapies of one kind or another, and avoiding scientifically substantiated science. We also see it in terms of our lawmakers and the things that we're being told are true and then evidentially find out are less so or not quite the case, where context is missing and so forth. The problem that we face is that we're increasingly surrounded by an environment of synthetic media where what is real and what is unreal is becoming harder and harder to distinguish. And the public are less and less equipped to know how to handle it. We know from surveys conducted by Ofcom, from the Electoral Commission, reputable organisations like Ipsos Mori and others, that the willingness of the public to trust information has descended over time. We also know that their understanding of the information environment has become harder and harder to determine because there's a lack of literacy. There's a lack of skills. There's a lack of understanding of of how to determine what they're seeing in front of them is real and unreal. And this is playing out in a whole variety of ways. So it could be on things that they're seeing in an international context, in the Middle East, for example, videos that are being shared purporting to show one country or another country doing something, and the footage is actually AI manipulated or taken out of context from another part of the world. Or it could be just a series of data, a data drop, for example, from government about NHS waiting times or about immigration figures, where there's a lack of context in the way that the information is presented, and the public are then unable to determine whether things are getting better or worse, or whether this is a good story or a bad story. The problem is an information paucity and a lack of literacy to a large extent.
So we position trust as one of the major shifts within the LIS MBA because of the whole kind of range of challenges associated with, potentially this kind of more challenging information environment, but also the opportunities for organizations who are really trying to prioritize being trusted and kind of building trust in different ways. What do you see as some of those opportunities?
Well, trust is at the heart of everything that we do. And I think for a course that encourages people to think laterally about the world around them, to make connections between their own lived experience, the institutions that are there to support them or guide them, the relationships that they're making with one another, with other organisations, the knowledge deficits that they find themselves in due to their circumstances or due to what they're experiencing online or through other institutions is absolutely essential. So a course that is able to join the dots between people's lived experience their understanding and their willingness to trust what's around them is, I think, an essential component for anyone who's serious about trying to determine their own future and their own employment opportunities in this incredibly distorted and polarized world that we're living in.
And you talked about part of the problem with trust of being to work out how much is it about, there being too little trust and how much is there being too much trust in the wrong things. How do you think about that kind of difficulty as an organization?
Yeah, I think part of the problem with trust is that we think of trust often in terms of the things that we're not able to understand or see, or a lack of transparency because what's being presented to us is very opaque, or we just lack the skills to determine it. I think another way of looking at the same issue is that we are sometimes too trusting of what we are presented with because of the relationships that we're forming with people who are influencers or peddlers of that information of one kind or another. I think this is particularly true of younger generations. We see it, certainly from my standpoint at Full Fact, we see a lot of the misinformation that is circulating online happens in a social media environment where people have forged relationships with people who have very opinionated views of one thing or another. So they have turned their back, if you like, on institutions. They've turned their back on reliable sources, partly because of the influence of the person that they have forged that relationship with and their willingness to disparage that substantiated point of view or that traditional point of view. And I think that's a really telling problem. And it's an issue that is not necessarily being solved by regulation or by legislation or by a lot of the traditional things and ways in which decision makers, educators, politicians, policymakers of one kind or another would have previously worked. I think you've got to go right the way back through the curriculum, which is why this course is so fantastically important, and almost relearn how to build a reliable narrative, how to pre-bunk, if you like, at scale as you are experiencing information, as you are learning your way or navigating your way through different sources of information. This isn't something that institutions are very well equipped on the whole to deal with, because they're coming at it from a very top-down position of this is scientifically true, this is economically the case, here is the evidence for it. But if somebody who's already got a relationship with another individual online, they have already invested in an alternative reality, they're not going to be taking the time, the trouble to think or reposition their thinking to an institution in that way. They're going to need to be re-educated or relearn why trust is important in another way.
So you would put a lot of your faith in individuals learning how to operate differently within this kind of environment?
Yes, I think so. In individuals learning and self-skilling, and in institutions supporting them through that process, that navigation process, if you like. So rather than it being a kind of us to them, institution to individual learning habit, which I think has been a traditional one for a lot of universities and educational establishments, I think this needs to be a much more self-taught process of understanding narrative, understanding ecosystems, understanding the way in which information plays out algorithmically online, how different biases and perceptions gain currency, and how we imperceptibly, in many cases, end up going down these rabbit holes and finding ourselves in positions of trust deficit of one kind or another.
And for Full Fact, as an organisation that's trying to kind of, I guess, help people through some of that navigation, obviously you being trusted yourself is a huge question. How do you try and manage that from a kind of organisational leadership perspective? Yeah,
it's really difficult, because often the people that you're most interested in getting through to are the ones that have the least relationship with the information that you are trying to distill and perpetuate, if you like. So the real challenge is trying to get to proxies, if you like, people that they may trust, who then may share the information, then they may see it. So we're having to use our own social media channels. We're having to use our own supporter network. We're having to think about partnerships and people who don't necessarily work directly for us, but maybe share the same values and the same outlook. Because ultimately, it's easier to get through to someone who is already invested in understanding why misinformation is spreading and why there is a trust deficit of one kind or another in what you're sharing. But the real beneficiaries are those who don't know that they're doing it, who don't know that they're sharing something that's false, who don't know what they don't understand. And that's a much, much harder relationship to build over time.
Mm-hmm. But it is through a kind of network-based, partner-based way of working that you're finding the opportunities to reach people differently.
Broadly speaking, yes. And then beyond that, obviously, we have people who write about our work in the media, who amplify our content from a political perspective as well, because they believe in what we do, and that's a cross-party experience. So the more people who are advocating for us, the more we get a platform, we get heard. But ultimately, those that are the most susceptible to the things that we are fact-checking are those who are probably the least able to understand how to self-correct. And so you need to get through to surrogates. You need to be able to get into their communities, if you like, which is why our social media strategy is a very big part of what we do.
What are you optimistic about in the field of trust? What opportunities are there that you're excited by?
Well, I'm an optimist by heart. I mean, I don't believe that people willingly share information, for the most part, that is untrustworthy. That I don't believe that people set out in public life to deceive. I don't believe in criminalising behaviour. And so I think at heart there is an opportunity for us to build a less toxic, more reliable information environment. I think that there is a consensus, a fairly broad consensus now across academia, across the political establishment, within the media, amongst policymakers more generally in this country, and in fact in many other countries, that we are facing a situation where the world is so polarised and reliable information is so hard to come across that we really need to do something about it. And the platforms, particularly those social media platforms who have such an ownership, if you like, over our information, have a big responsibility to play. So my optimism is that there is increasingly a concentration on those platforms to step up, and that over time there will be more regulation, there will be more opportunity for them to self-correct. At the moment, we're living in a world where the platforms have a lot more free rein than I think is healthy. That free speech has come to be known as anybody's speech, effectively. That it's not that there's no boundary, there's no barriers to people being able to say anything. That we've created an ecosystem where anybody can effectively disseminate any perspective, point of view that they think is interesting, without the terms of reference of the platforms necessarily taking action, unless it's directly harmful or defamatory in some way. I think that needs to change, but I think there is a consensus now that's building for that change, and it's just a matter of time before it happens.
So you see a tipping point towards a kind of an evolution of social media in general, in terms of becoming a more regulated environment?
I see a tipping point for digital media more generally. So I would put the generative AI, the large language models that we're seeing across the world that have now got such currency into the same bucket. I think, interestingly, we dropped the ball with social media. We let social media gain so much currency without regulation that it became a sort of a fundamentally harmful product. We've seen young people in desperately sad and self-harming situations, and we've seen some really horrific stuff being perpetuated through their platforms without mitigating action in a lot of circumstances. I think that we're learning from that almost in retrospect with the Gen AI revolution, and this is me, the optimist, what I hope we will see in time is that is self-corrected to the point that we don't simply allow these models and this technology to reign freely across our human experience, that we have some currency over it. And I think that will happen.
And for you personally, last question, just as you're trying to kind of shape the future of this field in your role, what do you rely on to make your own kind of decisions? How do you think about your role as an individual leader in all this?
Well, the irony is I grew up with Radio 4, and I worked at the BBC for 20 years, and I'm a great believer in traditional media in lots of ways. Sort of slightly ironic in the world that I live in, which is so much new media. But I have a variety of sources of information that I turn to. But I'm a believer in technology for good, but I'm also a believer in the power of trusted sources, and particularly when I'm most in need of context, I will turn first to those trusted sources before I will dive into an opinion piece or look for another perspective. So, but thankfully, I grew up with a navigation system for trusted sources, which is something I think it's so sorely missed by a lot of people, and I just wish more people felt able to find them and use them. But I feel fortunate in having that.
And perhaps something that needs kind of recreating as the evolution of what counts as a trusted source on what is changing all the time.
Exactly. Yeah, very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for sharing that.